Shake it is an African proverb, you will not, but many of them, you hear the noise when you shake it. And that then means that implementing the NDCs in the context of Africa needs inclusive partnerships. And that's the essence of this NDC partnership because the continent of Africa today needs over 3 trillion US dollars to implement the NDCs that have already been submitted by the continent. And this is nearly equivalent to the continent's GDP. And this is a lot of money. But on the flip side, as Jean Paul already alluded to, the 100 billion in annual finance that was promised to date, only about 80 billion of this amount has actually been met. And this amount, only 20 billion has actually come to Africa, representing only about 0.6% of what the region needs in the next 8 years. That's actually a minuscule of this. So the reality tells us that to implement the NDCs, we need to urgently prioritize partnerships as the primary, most practical strategy for mobilizing the means of implementation, both internally and externally. And this NDC hub is quite very timely and becomes the most important flagship initiative for the entire African continent. But I would like to just highlight 5 aspects that I think are quite very critical that will actually take us deeper into the conversation in the remaining hours that we have here. The first aspect, I think the Honorable Minister put it so nicely, is that of contextual reality. Because Africa is not a country. Africa is not a one data statistical point. There are disparities across the entire African continent today. If you take energy access, if you take Chad, for example, kilowatts hour per person is 13 kilowatt per annually. In South Africa, it's 600 per person. But when you look at the average, you will hear that it's Africa kilowatts per hour per year annually is 600. So you will look at Africa as if it is a country, and so you will look at it as if there are no disparities across the continent. Why I'm bringing this up is that context matters. And every community, even within the same country, is different. Their coping mechanisms are different. So we need to then reshape the narrative of how do we implement NDCs in a way that responds to the reality of people in the community within the contextual realities and not generalize it across as if Africa is just one country. The second aspect, which I think is very important, is that we need to prioritize sectors that Africa have a comparative advantage. An African proverb tells us that if you are roasting your corn, you do not walk away far from that corn. So you don't wander away from where you're roasting your corn because that corn can be taken off. So Africa's comparative advantage areas, if you look at all the NDCs, which we have analyzed that in the United Nations Environment Program, you will notice that 70% of all those NDCs have clean energy and sustainable agriculture. But the narrative around that is sometimes articulated without actually showcasing how do we leverage mitigation to power adaptation. So if you take a mother who is producing her vegetables in a village in Gabon, southern Gabon, or in northern Cameroon, or in northern Nigeria, or in southern Togo, and he or she loses that vegetable just because she doesn't have a simple solar dryer to dry that. At the end of the day, she will end up not having food to put on the table and money in her pockets. Therefore, we must be able to start looking at how do we to implement NDCs and prioritize sectors that Africa actually have got advantage in it. Because at the end of the day, we are talking in a continent whereby if you look at the aspect of finance, which is the third point that JP actually alluded to and put it within the context of blended finance, it becomes very important to look at. If you look at Africa today, market-driven financiers are not key players because of high perceived risk, especially in key NDC sectors like agriculture. And this is actually something that we need to look at very practically, and establishing a de-risking tool will become very important. But we cannot discuss finance in this case without actually looking at 80% of the jobs in the continent are in the informal sector. And this informal sector in communities, the informal sector, people don't have access to formal banking. So at the end of the day, sometimes the billions we talk on adaptation, we talk on mitigation, may end up not necessarily really reaching our mothers and brothers and sisters and fathers in communities and who are at the front line of the changing climate. It therefore means we must leverage on structures that are accessible to them, and these are communal cooperatives. Communal cooperatives are accessible to our mothers. In Cameroon, where I come from, we call them Yangis, some things. In East Africa, they call them Chamas. I believe there is a name for West Africa and North Africa. But the reality is that we must be able to leverage those structures. And what UNICA did, the Economic Commission, did 3 years ago was to look at how much is Africa investing on adaptation. And Africa is actually investing 20% of the amount. They're investing 2 billion every year. So we need to start looking, how do we leverage that internal resources to de-risk investments that can go through these cooperatives to reach the people that matter. And that takes me to the fourth point, which is you can only compete from a position of strength. And Africa's strength is her youth. Africa's youth are the powerhouse to drive the implementation of NDCs. But they need to be inspired. They need to be inspired to actually be able to leverage this opportunity to create enterprises. And one of the ways to do this is to provide incentives. And these incentives still need to go through structures that can reach this informal youth. Because in platforms like this, most of the young people, like carpenters, like bricklayers that are in communities, they will never have access to this information. So how do we ensure that at least we leverage these communal cooperatives and local structures to reach these young people? It becomes very, very important. And the last part is data. Without data, and the Honorable Minister did explain this the other day during the opening in your video, how Gabon has actually invested a lot of money to put systems in place to monitor, to report and to verify, satellites in place. If we do not look at what is working and document that data, we might always be starting from scratch as if nothing is working. But whereas we have a lot of excellent, innovative success stories that could inspire others to take it forward. This African NDC's hub is both a resource center and therefore a pivot for the continent to be able to leverage. As this African proverb goes, which is the last one, he who does not seize opportunity today will be unable to seize tomorrow's opportunity. Let's seize this opportunity to discuss realistic solutions that can touch the lives of mothers in communities. Thank you.